Welcome to Surface Embroidery Stitches. Let's practice our stitches outside of our work. So this is where hopefully you have a piece of scrap fabric in a frame, a needle and thread that you like to use. Today I want to use a pearl cotton with a heavier needle so that it's nice and visible on the screen. Normally I would like to work with something a little bit finer. Let's start with a chain stitch. So I've knotted my material or my thread on the back and I'm ready to start. So typically we would go up and down in the same hole. Doesn't matter too much if it's the next hole over. And then I'm going to move forward along my stitch line. Let's do a bigger stitch than I would normally do. And with my back hand, I'm catching the thread to tension it. And then I will pull this length up. So again, up and down more or less in the same place, holding onto the loop here, and then up, tensioning on the back and forward. And let's do 2 more of those. So here's what happens if I drag this. With this thread it won't matter too much, but it does make it harder to keep my tension even, and it's more likely that I'll end up with snags on the back. So what I really want to do is catch that on my fingers on the back, tension it, and down. And then the important part of any loop stitch is the tacking stitch. Chain stitch, or lazy daisy being a loop stitch. So we're going to tack this down at the end, otherwise there's a chance that the whole thing comes unraveled. But if I want to go in the opposite direction and I don't want to have to restart somewhere else, I can do something called reverse chain. This is also really handy for people who prefer to work a little bit slower, or who have had it happen where they've pulled a little too tightly and then their whole work has come undone. So for this, I started out with the tacking stitch, and it's a little slower because we're only ever doing one part at a time. Adjust my tension. There we go. So I'm going to come underneath both parts of the stitch that I've just done, and then back down. And at all points in time, my stitch is tacked down, so I don't have to worry about it coming apart on me if I have to drop it all of a sudden, like for instance if a cat jumps in my lap. So the important thing is that once you've finished, your chain stitch and reverse chain stitch should be more or less indistinguishable. I sometimes find reverse chain to be a little bit tidier because I can get sloppy with the placement of my chain stitches, and I'm way less sloppy with the placement of my reverse chain because I have to spend more time on it. So it really is a matter of personal preference. They will look identical at the end so long as they're done a little bit less sloppy than I've done them here. But let's keep going on an angle with our chain stitch, and I'll make a shape here. And what I would like to do here is to turn this corner. So I can either, actually, turning a corner with a reverse chain is a little bit less nice than turning a corner with a chain stitch. If I were to just leave this be, you'll see how this wants to flop open over this way. What it really needs is to be tacked in the other direction. So I'm going to come up and do a tiny tacking stitch, and that will hold that corner nice and tight where I want it to be so that I can carry on with my stitching. So now that I've outlined a shape in chain stitch, what I want to do is start the detached buttonhole. So this stitch has a tacking or grounding line that's going to come across, which is going to keep all of our stitches in the same direction, and will keep them from curving too much. Otherwise there's a distinct concave curve that this stitch gets. And because I switched my stitches halfway through, I don't really want to use this side as my top. So what I'm going to do is come up just a little bit below the top here and straight across and down. I'm going to come up just below that side. I'm going to keep both my hands on top here because it'll help me to control. If I have made these stitches evenly, then I can probably do one detached buttonhole stitch in each of my chain stitches. If they were uneven, I might have to skip some or double up. But I'm going to go underneath, hooking into my chain stitch, and then I'm going to go underneath my tacking stitch and then over top of the trailing end of my buttonhole. And then I'm not going through the fabric again. So underneath the next one, underneath the tacking stitch, over top of my trailing end, and let's go across. Okay, so next one. Ideally, I want to keep a nice even tension and not pull too tightly. I find detached buttonhole looks nicest when it's done with smaller stitches, but that is something that you kind of figure out for yourself as you go. So when we get to the end of the row, then it's down and back up just a little bit lower and across. There we are. And the next one. So part of why I've chosen a triangular shape here is because I want to show that we're now going to be working in the sort of spaces in between. Oh, helps if I move my hand out of the way, doesn't it? And the spaces in between are where the bars will line up next, so that these kind of brick opposite to each other, which works nicest when the diameter of the stitch is changing. So if, for instance, my piece is getting smaller, then I'll skip the first space and go into the second one. But if my piece is getting bigger, then I will use the edge spaces as well. The other thing is that if your piece is going to be consistent, then you get to decide whether you want to go in one end or the other. Do you alternate or do you keep it the same? Practice and experiment with that. So I'm going to skip the first one, go through, try to ignore the meowing cat, and just keep stitching. And then again, down at the end, I'm going to take some time to finish this and pay attention to Miss Meows over there. And right, hopefully with fewer interruptions from my feline assistants. Here we are at the end. I've done my last stitch. Now, because I've come to a point, it's pretty easy for me to just finish off with the one stitch. However, if I were at a long part, then what I might do would be either to hook it into these stitches here, just as I did at the start, or I could leave it free floating, just like these were before we started working into them again, and then I could tack it down with a line of running stitch or back stitch to the edges of the shape. So give that a try. But next we're going to do, before I move on, I suppose, I wanted to point out to you how, see how the lines here of the stitch happen in between each other. And so sometimes you'll have to decide, do you want it to be a little bit closer together, move them, or maybe you need to not decrease that particular row. So next, let's do a bit of Elizabethan double ladder stitch. So, you know what? Let me just mark my lines here. Sure. Let's move over and we will go this way. Just going to give myself a guideline. And what that means is that I don't want to come up there because I want to come up here. Okay, so this stitch starts out a little bit complicated, but then it gets very, very easy. So I have to determine what are the edges of my stitch, and I want to work across each other to the start. So I've come up on, if I'm going up, what's the left, and then down on the right, and then I'm going to come up in between them, all more or less along the same horizontal plane. I'm not going to pull this very tight, and then I'm going to go down on the left at the top. Okay, and then I'm going to come up on the right. This is the one that's really weird, the long stitch. So I'm going to go over here, under both of these, around the top, open that out a little bit, because I want to come around the top and then under the X on this side, which is where I really need these to be a little more open. Nope, just doesn't want to cooperate. There it is. Okay, under the X on that side. Now I can tighten that a little bit. Use my finger to kind of tension that, and down. All right, that was the first stitch is weird. Now let's carry on. So across from where I went down, I'm going to come up on the left. And from now on, I'm always going to go down on the right, up on the left. So I'm going to go down over 2 bars across the center, and then under the X there, come out with 1 foot, and now the 2nd foot that I've just put in on the top. Sorry, moving my needle through the thread. And I'm going to go over the top, past 1, 2 feet on this side, and then spread that a little bit. Up over 1 bar that I've already done, and the 2nd bar that I've just added, and down. Okay, so now that we've done that, and apparently knotted thread, there we go. Let's try that again. Up on the left, across 1, 2 bars, out the side, over the top, across 1, 2 feet, up, and then going over 1 bar from the previous stitch, and the one we just did, and down. So you can see how this moves. And so we're always kind of tacking the last 2 stitches together with the next one. And if you find that when you pull, it pulls these stitches together, don't worry, because the other side of it is going to separate them a little bit. And down. Just try to remain consistent in how large your stitches are. That's where having lines down to show where you're going to stitch makes it a little bit easier. Okay, and then there are 2 different ways to finish off when I get to the end. I can either just come out the middle and tack it down like I did at the start. What I prefer to do is tack, you know what, let's do 1 more, because I have enough thread and I feel like it's worth it. Okay, so come up, come around, and in, there we go. So I'll tack, but not go forward quite as far as I would have. I'll just tack a little bit ahead, and then same, I'm going to come a little bit ahead and tack down those first 2 stitches. So then it just kind of finishes off, it's not going anywhere, and this gives you 2 sort of braids at the side. as well as those ladders in the middle. And that looks really nicely when it's done in a stiff thread like a pearl cotton or in a metallic thread. And then the last stitch that I want to do, I'm going to have to rethread my needle. So the reason why I consider this one a bonus is that most of the embroidery that you'll want to do can be done by outlining in chain stitch, also using chain stitch as a linear stitch. And then the Elizabethan double ladder works really nicely to create those vines. But sometimes a flower or an element has a center, and it's nice to be able to do that in something that really pops. So let's do a Spiderweb Rose. So for this, it has to be an uneven number of points. Usually it's 5. So I'm just going to draw my 5 points on here. That one is where I started. They don't have to be perfect. Sometimes it's easiest to draw them. So I will go across to one of these far points. I'm not going to pull very tight. And then I'll come up in between them. There. Go down to one of these two. Not pull very tight. And then come up at the last point. Now, if I were going to change thread color, this is where I would go down into the center and then change my thread color and use another thread to wrap if I were doing a rose shape. However, for this, I'm going to hook underneath. There we go. And then kind of pull them a little bit to the center, and now we're going to start to weave, and it'll be over under, at which point you'll see why it has to be an odd number of arms. So I'm going to go over and under, and over and under, and over. Let's use the left hand for that. And under, and over, and under. I'm just going to keep wrapping around, over, under. And if I've done it correctly, then where I have gone under the last time, I'll be going over the next time so that it weaves in and out on the Spiderweb Rose. So the important part of this is that I need to control my tension. If I want it to sit flat, then I can't pull too tight. But if I want to pull a little bit more tightly, then I'll get more of a three-dimensional sort of button shape on this. And that depends entirely on the look you want. And you keep going until either you have enough and you want to stop, regardless of whether the arms are still showing, or until you can't go any further. Because, like for instance here, I'm not going to be able to get under that arm there much more. So when you decide that you're done, get under that one. Yeah, I can go around once more. When I decide that I'm done here, I can't get under this one, so I'm just going to go down in between two of them before and under. And there I go. So chain stitch and reverse chain will give me outlines for areas for the double buttonhole, and then the double ladder stitch makes nice thick lines, and then the Spiderweb Rose will give me nice sort of button centers. So next, let's see what that looks like when we put it into the work.